Welcome back to Left, Wrong, and Center. This is episode 3. And this week's topic is going to be kind of the inverse of last week's. How did we get here? And this week's is where do we go? Where does the Democratic Party go? And it's kind of a rhetorical question because I obviously don't have an answer that has seen into the future of what's going to work. But this question has irked me more than many others. Probably not because it's being asked so much as because various people have been rising to the podium, really starting before the election was even over, before people had started voting. But really, I mean, mere hours after Harris lost the election, you had various guys coming forward and saying, here's the answer, here's what we did wrong, here's what Democrats need to do. And they're doing this in an attempt to be the hero that shines the incontrovertible light of truth upon a broken party licking its wounds following a devastating loss. And they're trying to kind of fill what they see as a leadership vacuum in the party. And the truth of the matter is that this has happened each and every time Democrats have fill in the blank, won or lost an election. It happened after Hillary Clinton's loss in 2016. It happened after Joe Biden's win in 2020. It happened after we had historically good midterms in 2022. The complaint was that we didn't do even better. It happens every time. And if we go back to the last presidential election, Joe Biden won the popular vote by 7 million votes, 4.5%. And in this election, he flipped Georgia and Arizona, which have not gone blue in decades, had not gone blue in decades at that point, and won back all 3 blue wall states, held Nevada, held New Hampshire, and made major inroads in states like Texas and Alaska, where his margin of victory or his margin of loss, he still lost those states, but I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think Texas was within 6 points. And that is a big red stronghold state. So, and anybody who's thinking about the 2024 results in response to me saying that, we will talk about that. But my point is that after Joe Biden did very well in 2020 with his win, I think we all hoped it would be bigger, but he did well and he won and he did what he needed to do. The think pieces about which direction he needed to move in. He needs to move to the center. He needs to move to the left. And then the battle throughout his presidency of which direction the legislation needs to move in. He needs to be more progressive. No, he needs to cater more to the centrist flank of the party. It's just maddening. We had a trifecta for 2 years, albeit very narrow. And every single person, because of that narrow margin in the Senate, in the House, got to be a king for a day and got to dictate and got to steal, oxygen and the spotlight and push forward their idea of what needs to happen. And that is what caused unraveling and division and inter-party fighting. And that's what causes us to lose. So notably, the Republican Party only ever faces scrutiny and pressure around individual candidates and rarely issues. After the 2022 midterms, which should have been, if you look at, we were at 9% inflation, perception drives everything. So with the gas prices being what they were, even though that's not Biden's fault, that's not Democrats' fault, gas prices were through the roof. And those midterms should have been a bloodbath for Democrats. We should have gotten absolutely blown out. Under a Democratic trifecta, people's perceptions and the disinformation machine were hard at work and inventing a reality in which Democrats were raising prices and making everything worse, rather than the reality, which is that the opposite was happening and that the recovery is always going to be slower than we want it to be. But the the only lingering question that really came out of the 2022 midterms in terms of accountability for Republicans was not about Republicans' stances on issues or on how far to the right they are as a party. It's about, will it be Trump or will it be DeSantis in 2024? And it became a brief horse race before it was not. Abortion, which was the issue that made that election what it was given a cursory glance by the media and by the party. But ultimately, the GOP not only did not moderate on the issue that walloped them in those elections, they moved further to the extreme right, and they selected a freshman senator who supports a national abortion ban as their vice presidential candidate in 2024, ran their losing presidential candidate a third time, and won. So the most salient take that I have seen yet on the internet, and this is a very rare thing that I'm going to say, a very rare thing, is from Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. You're not going to hear me look to her as a beacon of truth very often, but what she came out of the gate and said is that the Democratic Party needs to wait and see, respond to Trump's administration, all of these things that are coming down the pipeline. We need to wait and see how Trump governs, who gets confirmed, what happens across the globe before jumping to a knee-jerk conclusion about what the Democratic Party needs to do, which direction we need to move in to win in the future. Now, this time is a little different. Democrats are understandably in a position of frustration, upset, and fear, frankly. We're facing an issue that we have not faced for 2 solid decades, which is that Trump, on his third try, after 2 impeachments, after an attempted coup, and 8 years of chaos in the national political driver's seat, finally managed not only to win the Electoral College, but eke out a popular vote win, albeit very narrow. To put it plainly, that sucks. What sucks more is that safe blue states like New Jersey, New York, and Virginia, which still went to Harris by, decent margins, went to Harris by less than safe margins. And many are using this as justification over their panic and need for answers. However, if you look at the 2020 election, where the safe red giant state of Texas, as I mentioned earlier, went to an incumbent Republican president by just 5.6 points. Democrats have had eyes on Texas for a long time, and the state has shown signs of trending blue. But this is the inverse of that. And look what happened in Texas this time. Alaska went to Trump by nearly 15 points in 2016, but only 10 in 2020. The point that I'm making is that we shouldn't dismiss the concerns. Absolutely not. But while the Republican Party gains in safe blue states are something we need to not assume are a fluke, even if they are, we need to assume that they're not. They're not a trend at this point. Texas returned to a 14-point win for Trump in 2024. That's an 11-point swing to the right. Alaska went back to 13 points. So, there's an ebb and flow, and in an election like this dominated by low information voters who are motivated to oust the party that they see as in control and seated by many Democratic voting blocs, there's going to be movement against us on our home turf in the numbers, especially by people living in places like New York City, Los Angeles, all throughout New Jersey, these places that are just safe and reliably blue, where the threat of a second Trump presidency feels remote and feels like less of a concern because, I'm surrounded by this big blue bubble and I don't like what Biden's doing. And you know what? I can protest vote, or I can vote third party. It's a lack of ability. It's not a lack of ability. It's a lack of choice to choose to see the big picture. So the question that I find myself asking is, with everything that I've said already, including that we need to assume that this is not a fluke, even if it ends up being a fluke, my question is, does what happened in 2024, a narrow popular vote losses in the battleground states, does that really mean that Democrats need to totally and completely reinvent our brand? I personally think it is too soon to safely say yes, but I do not believe that doing nothing is the answer either. It's a tough position to be in as a party when you're championing policies and ideas that are broadly popular and have a track record of implementing them when given majorities, but we suffer from an image issue. I think that's the root of the Democratic Party's problems. As just one example of what I'm talking about when it comes to policy, YouGov, which is rated the number 4 pollster on 538, and I know everyone's over polls, but it turns out a lot of the polls were right this time, did a survey of voters, and they blindly tested policy popularity amongst these voters with no disclosure of who proposed the policy. So these policies included Harris's plans for funding detection technology for fentanyl at the border, to her plan to increase funding of home care for seniors, to funding job training and addiction recovery services for former prisoners, to imposing tougher penalties against companies harming the environment. Overall, they did an even split. They tested 64 Harris policies and 64 Trump policies. 89%, that is 57 of the 64 Harris policies, were supported by more than half of Americans. 10 of those policies had more than 80% support. 28 of those policies had more than 70% support. 35 of those policies had more than 2/3 support, and 46 of them had more than 60% support. 46 of the 64 policies that Harris proposed, when surveyed as policies not attributed to a candidate, have enough support that if the Senate truly represented the people, should pass through the Senate without needing to overcome the filibuster. 60%, 60 votes. I mean, it's an imperfect comparison, but you hopefully get what I'm getting at. All of this talk about being divided as a country, and I'm not saying we're not, but all of this talk about being divided, and 46 of the 64 policies that were surveyed have 60% support amongst Americans. Harris's least popular policy proposals were, of course, around cultural and race-related and driven issues, like allowing more refugees legally into the U.S., opposing efforts to ban race-related books and content in schools, which was still supported by about 50% of people, by the way. But that's her some of her least popular policies are around these issues. Pretty sad to me that opposing efforts to ban books specifically is not supported by more people. Increasing federal funding for HBCUs was toward the bottom of her list. So when you look at the meat and potatoes, bread and butter of Democratic policy, the vast majority of it is very popular. And then you get into the ones like these, where you're talking about refugees and books and HBCU funding, and those are the ones that catch the lightning rod in culture and are blown up and presented as all Democrats care about, and then people run with that and they believe it, and we're viewed as the party of cultural identity and identity politics, when that's not the case at all. Now, I'm going to continue that thought by saying these are not the issues. These less popular ones. These are not the issues that drove Harris's campaign. Harris's most popular policies were her focal point in every single speech, rally, and interview. Kamala Harris ran her 3-month campaign focused, laser focused on the economy. It doesn't mean that she doesn't have beliefs on identity-related issues. It doesn't mean that there would not be policies implemented on those issues. She did not talk about those issues. Those issues were not front and center. She ran on the economy. She ran on housing. She ran on price gouging. She ran on home care for seniors. These are the issues that she chose to highlight and put front and center. So anyone saying that Harris was too focused on transgender issues is lying to you, A, or B, were susceptible to the Trump ads that told them that Harris was too focused on transgender issues, that were blasted throughout the battleground, specifically Pennsylvania, and fell for it and voted accordingly. Like I said, low information voters decided this race. Now, by contrast, just 48%, 31 of the 64 policies of Trump's that were surveyed were supported by more than half of Americans, and just one makes the top 5. Harris's least popular proposal had 32% of support, while his least popular proposal had 23% support. So Harris's proposals overall for both sets of supporters had an average of 67% support when blindly tested, compared to an average of 51% for Trump's. And her policies were more popular with her supporters than his were with his. So Kamala Harris's base and Democratic voters were broadly more aligned with Harris than Republicans and MAGA are with Trump. So why is the pressure coming out of these on Democrats to reinvent and rebrand? Republicans have weaponized and successfully hijacked a number of facets within American culture, and using algorithmic tools and the media, which is very much on their side, and general ignorance as their fertile ground, they have grown fringe issues into mainstream, permeating the narrative culture. So this, combined with the myth of the liberal media and the Democratic Party becoming the party of college-educated people, has allowed Republicans to find a new way to be professional victims, and Democrats painted as their abusers. For instance, approximately 0.5% of Americans are transgender. Transgender issues are human issues, but they are not issues that affect the day-to-day life of the vast majority of Americans. And those of us who are old enough to remember the 2000s know that trans is the new gay, because the same thing happened back then. And the 90s, I remember this being an issue for Clinton. I don't remember. I was barely alive, but have read plenty about how gays in the military really hurt Clinton in his first few months in office. But when, going back to what I was saying about transgender people, when Nancy Mace and Ron DeSantis and J.D. Vance and other Republicans need your vote and know that their politics are designed to pick your pocket, their policies are designed to pick your pocket and rob your parents and your grandparents of their Social Security benefits, and they know that these beliefs and these policies are not popular and won't earn your vote on their own, they know that they can scare the ignorant into being afraid of the scary trans woman in the bathroom at Target who really just has to pee. It benefits them to have an enemy. It benefits their evangelical voters and base to have someone to constantly rail against in a righteous crusade. It benefits anti-LGBT lobbies who control money and fundraise off of the fear and hatred of anyone under that umbrella. And then it benefits the party brand to claim that they, as Christians, are being discriminated against in mainstream culture for their difference of opinion. And then it benefits the media, ever afraid of the Trump-loving CEOs and being labeled as biased to the Democrats, to report think pieces on transgender bathroom laws and kids being radicalized in school and being taught to identify as cats, and to have an opinion panel to discuss this issue that now has 50% of the country, this issue that only affects 0.5% of Americans, now has blown up into this thing where half of our country is ready to burn everything down over this issue that does not affect them. But in starting a culture war and in the media legitimizing it and fanning the flames in the name of objectivity to Republicans, the party has succeeded in pinning a losing cultural war position on the Democrats, because people are adverse. They don't like change. So it is a losing issue out of the gate. But the Democrats are the party of civil rights, and thus we continue to be the party that champions all people. And this fear and this blowing up of these issues and the focus on these issues that are highly polarizing and that people are angry about, and it gives people something to be pissed off about and claim that, you know, we're becoming too radical and all of that. That is what continues to get Republicans elected, despite horribly unpopular policy beliefs on things that actually will affect the very people who vote for them. Then, when Democrats lose elections, which is inevitable, Republicans are going to win elections sometimes, people ignore every ounce of nuance and context, interchanging, like I said, taking an attack ad on Kamala Harris in the state of Pennsylvania that slams her for caring about they, them, while Trump cares about you. They take that and they either unknowingly, unintentionally, or on purpose switch it for Harris herself being too focused on transgender issues in her campaign and not enough on the economy. Harris's only memorable mention, and I followed this campaign very closely, of trans rights or issues at all, and she has a very progressive record on that issue, by the way. She's been an advocate and champion of the LGBT community as a whole, but she's been very progressive on trans issues, historically speaking. The only memorable mention of trans rights that she made was a response to a loaded question in her interview on, you guessed it, Fox News, where she kind of gave an answer and said, this is an issue that affects 0.5% of the population. Can we move on to something else? Which is a game that she has to play. Harris's pillar policy positions were banning price gouging, affordable housing, which is a huge issue, expansion of the child tax credit, and immigration reform. These are all economic issues based in broad appeal. So it can feel like a losing fight because it places pressure on Democrats to change, despite the reason for incorrect perception being outside of our control. Others leap immediately to Harris's race and gender as the reason we lost the election and say that the country is not ready for a woman. And I hate when people say that. I hate when people say it with defeat rather than, because if that's true, and I go back and forth on whether I believe that it is, but if that's true, what are you doing to change it? I have occasional doubts on this. I go back and forth between, are people simply too bigoted, or are we overthinking a 49-48 election, and are we in danger as a result of overcorrecting? Kamala Harris began her sprint campaign in July with a 37% approval rating, which was largely tied to Biden's. It was actually lower because she was seen as having no unique role in her in the administration, and was largely kept hidden away. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes that the Biden administration made. It was hiding Harris away. She took that first month where people were attacking her for not putting out detailed policy proposals and going and doing interviews. She took that first month and she did mega rallies, and she reintroduced herself to the country, and she got people realizing that she's eloquent, she's smart, she is funny, she's very capable of energizing a crowd and inspiring people. And in a matter of 2 months, that number, that 37% number, had jumped. And that's an average, it's a 538 average, but that number had jumped to hovering just under 50% in most surveys. That is remarkable. So did her race and her gender play a role in her loss? I have absolutely no doubt that it did. I truly believe that, and I saw it. I saw it in comments and in people's attitudes. What I think played more of a role this specific time was her ties to a wrongly unpopular administration in an age, in an era where the world is rejecting incumbents. And we're going to talk about that in a later episode. Those who are jumping to her race and gender may have a point. They may be right that it must be a white guy going forward, but they also may be, retreating to their 2016 trauma, where I believe the race and gender element of Harris's loss is very present. I believe Hillary Clinton lost in 2016. I believe her gender played much more of a role in that loss. So I think people have a point, but I think there's also a retreat to 2016 trauma, and understandably so. And then others still believe that the Democratic Party is too far to the left, while internet leftists blame its centrism. So we have seen time and time again that candidates perceived as more moderate tend to perform better in elections. There are occasional exceptions to this rule, and I'm going to say this name, and in 2025 it's going to hit differently than it did in 2022. But John Fetterman ran his Senate campaign in Pennsylvania in the primary and in the general in a Democratic midterm, and what should have been an anti-Biden smackdown, as a pretty progressive candidate. He ran against a centrist, Conor Lamb, in the primary and bodied him. No offense, Conor Lamb, if you're one of the three people listening. And I like Conor Lamb. Bodied him. I mean, knocked him out. And then ran against Dr. Oz, a MAGA, sympathizer at the time, and won by 5 points in the general election after having a stroke and really odd debate performance in 2022. I mean, after all of that, he won by 5 points. But Fetterman presents as incredibly, and you can argue till the cows come home on this, on the reality of this, but Fetterman presents himself as very working class. If you look at him, he's very rough around the edges, traditionally masculine in many ways, and for lack of a better term, looks real and salt of the earth. So Fetterman stomping around Pennsylvania in basketball shorts may turn a lot of people off, but it appeals to many, many more people. And I remember saying that at the time, that the basketball shorts and hoodies were going to help him win, as people complained about him not wearing suits and not dressing up. So more than anything, I believe one takeaway has become clearer than many, which is that the excessive use of internet buzzwords permeating into mainstream liberal and moderate circles has harmed our party and harmed our party brand. It appeals only to, those things appeal only to unreliable voters, the ones for whom the Democratic Party will never be pure enough, and it puts off those who do not see themselves reflected in the purity tests that are presented daily now. So rightly or wrongly, and we could argue, the excessive utilization of language like this makes Democrats look like snooty college professors looking down our noses at well-meaning laymen. To put it crudely, I am far from the first person to say this, and I will not be the last person to say this. I don't agree that the takeaways of many of those internet buzzwords and the intent behind the introduction of them, I don't agree that that's always a bad thing, or even mostly a bad thing, but it's about the presentation. I think this criticism has been one of the most consistently sound critiques of Democrats that has actually stood the test of time as social progression has rightly accelerated. It is always going to be easier to sell, easier, not right, not better, easier to sell a familiar past to people than an uncertain future. even if the reality of that past is not as rosy as its repackaging suggests, and even if the possible reality of that future as proposed would be far better. I said it after the 2020 election as well, many times. Liberalism and progression are viewed wrongly in America as a luxury that we can only have when our bases, and by our bases, I'm putting that in heavy quotes, the needs and interests of the people who we view as default in this country are covered, because liberalism has wrongly but successfully been branded as an ideology of superfluous interests and ideas rather than a key to our advancement as human beings and as a country. We should have moved on from so many current cultural battles that we are still having so long ago. We shouldn't have to keep watering down racial and gender and sexual issues to people who don't understand them after all these years and who don't want to understand them after all these years. It gets more enraging as time goes on. So when people online, and young people specifically, get angry about this, I'm right there with you. But it's not a given, and it never has been, that people's attitudes continue to progress on those issues by default. Regression is a real thing, and we lose our right to vote with this mindset more and more with every election in which we throw up our hands and we cede ground and results in the name of purity, giving outsized influence to the people who are hostile to the very issues that we claim to care about, and through whose leadership, when they get those positions of power, their leadership influences mindsets around those issues. And those issues are then influenced legislatively and through attitudes in a regressive manner. People's mindsets on these issues, on race and gender and sexuality and gender identity, do not spin forward as a default. They spin forward with education and with seeing, again, to put it crudely, that, oh, those people aren't hurting me. Of course they should have rights. That's the way that people view these issues. People view things as a zero-sum game. They have to feel comfortable that they're not actually being hurt by these scary ideas before they're going to adopt them and be okay with them. And the more we let people into positions of power and positions of public influence that are hostile to those ideas, the more regression we are going to see rather than progression. As the center of this country is pulled further to the right because Democratic-aligned voters at both edges of the tent either sit out elections or decide to vote for the other side, we don't really get to say that the answer is to keep beating the reliable voters who always vote, just not always vote for us, over the head with lofty lefty language. That reality only enrages the left flank more, causing a double down and protest sit out or protest vote, and it's a prophecy of failure destined to repeat until we snap out of it. My most important takeaway from this election is that moral outrage may mobilize people, but it does not convince people to vote for Democrats who weren't going to already. It has become, unfortunately, very clear that economic issues, and again, this is not me saying Democrats don't talk about the economy, because we do. But it has become very clear that economic issues or perceived economic issues will always beat out moral ones. Democrats talk about the economy, and as we've discussed, our policies are more popular than Republican policies. But as close to an answer as I think I can cobble up in my mind for where the Democratic Party goes, it really feels like the way forward, and again, I'm not the first to say this, is to refocus cultural conversations, not ignore them, not dismiss them and not have them, but refocus them and redirect them through the lens of the economy. When Republicans want to bludgeon America about a trans woman using the bathroom, We need to pivot that attack and affirm that you stand with voters on their pocketbooks and economic interests, and you stand with that trans woman using the bathroom, and that you stand with the school with the non-controversial book that mentions themes of race by speaking directly to the voter and rhetorically reminding them that it is Republicans and not trans people using the bathroom and not books or school libraries that want to cut Social Security and raise taxes. I think it's reductive to simply say that trans issues are being used as a distraction, because I do believe that there is genuine hatred, and a lot of genuine hatred on the right for trans people. And again, this is just the issue that I'm choosing because it's the lowest hanging fruit here. It's the most obvious one. But call them out for what they're trying to do. They're using innocent people who are just trying to live their life as a distraction for what they want to do to your money. And they do want to harm trans people, but behind it all is funneling more money to the richest people in America. Same with abortion. Same with almost any other cultural issue. I think Democrats, the way forward for us is to present as moderate and reasonable, speak softly and carry a big stick, sign progressive legislation on these issues, on abortion, on trans rights, on gay rights, on civil rights, and all of it. But redirect these issues, conversations on these issues, when they come up in campaigns, to the economy and when selling them. In an era where human rights are viewed as zero-sum, we don't really have an option, in my opinion. People are going to choose their pocketbooks and their bank accounts every time. It's wrong, it's bad, and yet it feels like our new reality. So those saying meet voters where they are, I think rarely know what they mean when they say that. Most voters support gay rights. Most voters support access to abortion. Most believe in climate change and agree that it's bad and man-made. Most support or say they would support anti-racist values, even if we don't live up to them all the time. Most don't really. I would say, I don't know what the stats are on this, and a trans person may have a very different perception than I do. I don't think most people really care if someone's trans. They might not get it. But if asked about it in a vacuum, I don't think most people would say that they care. Most people don't really care if someone's an immigrant either. Face-to-face, interpersonal, until it's politicized. But most of the people that we need to convince also do not view these issues as mobilizing issues, because they don't believe it's central or an important factor in their lives, and it's become clear that right and wrong arguments do not change that. Every one of these issues can be turned on its head and be won by Democrats at the polls, and we can see meaningful advancement as a result if we connect them or redirect them to why these are not the issues that are harming you, and it is actually Republicans' regressive economic policies that are. The biggest and most frustrating caveat of all of this, though, is that Democrats, as we are in the present, without making one single change to how we operate, are already more policy-focused at every turn than our opposition. Harris was drilled on policy throughout her sprint to the presidency. Trump was not. Democrats are asked at every turn how we are going to pay for absolutely everything. Republicans are not. We are more policy-focused, and very obviously so. And the fact that we are the party backed into a corner on this is wild. So all of these thoughts are presented as possible ways for Democrats to improve on our performance, not as agreements that Democrats are not focused on the economy. So kind of moving away from policy and the economy for a minute, and this will come up many times, I think, on this podcast, but Democrats need our own misinformation combatants, and we need to stake our own claim within media. This is the best action item I've seen yet, and it's not a quick fix. Fox News did not erupt into what it is overnight. I thought with Harris taking over at the top of the ticket, Harris HQ did a nice job on social media for a certain audience of cutting into the noise online and making, memorable and getting some viral moments and simplifying a bit of messaging down to bite-sized phrases and takeaways for a 3-month span. It was, about the best we could have hoped for. It's not enough, but it was a good start and a decent blueprint for the internet. But it needs to be replicated on a larger scale in media, both politically centered and not. Not every right-wing misinformation machine is branded or sold as a political thing in nature. Joe Rogan, as an example, is inherently political, and yet people listen to him just because I like what he has to say about whatever it is. He's not talking about elections. Most information is spread casually to unsuspecting, aka non-captive audiences, and repetition is key. That's what happened to Hillary Clinton with the email scandal. Democrats are going to have trouble here because in order to continue to be credibly different, and we are credibly different from the Republicans, we have to base our communications largely in truth. It's difficult to know how you gain influence amongst casual listeners without outrage bait based on lies, and how you go on offense with the truth. I'm also about to wade into very controversial waters here, so bear with me. I know some of my friends even are not going to fully get me on this. Luigi Mangione, as a very recent example, shot and killed the CEO of United Healthcare. Murder is wrong and bad. We should just be able to say that. Yes, the memes are funny. Yes, he definitely works out. Yes, the reasoning behind the anger that drove the act makes sense. And yes, our healthcare system is broken and in many cases very evil. But you know which political party is the only one both routinely trying to help and has a track record of helping? Democrats. You know who online progressives are leaping on for this? For the condemnation of murder? Josh Shapiro, right after this happened, the governor of Pennsylvania, who's a likely contender for the 2028 Democratic nomination, condemned this act, as any politician will and would. And online leftists are leaping on Josh Shapiro. Nobody else, just Democrats. We're just attacking Democrats. I don't know what you would expect from a mainstream American politician. And if you want a different kind of mainstream American politician, well, now's the time. Now is the time to organize around somebody for 2028. If you don't want to see Josh Shapiro as the nominee in 2028, right now is the time to organize, find somebody that you like, who can sell a winning message to over half of the Democratic Party in all of the primary states, and then over half of the country in the general. Now's the time. So, this is not my statement on Luigi Mangione, because I can say with my full chest that murder is bad and that we should not live in a country where murder is the solvent to our problems, and yet that's where things are. That's the direction that it looks like a lot of things are headed, where we just handle things with violence, and that in itself suggests a very broken system. I think the whole issue is very, very complex, and I understand the anger and I understand people's reactions to him. But as long as the infographic-driven form of activism continues to be seen as the center of gravity of what being a progressive or a liberal means, and by extension, as long as online progressives refuse to read the room, accept a wink and a nod in a campaign season where you are not the central focus all the time on literally any attitude or position they view as not pure enough, things are going to continue to get worse. Noble intentions and beliefs are good. Wanting to call out United Healthcare and other insurance providers is a good thing, and one that should be done, and one that we need to see a change made on. Our healthcare system and proposed solutions to our healthcare system need to be This is an issue where I believe Democrats can move to the left on and win. But it needs to be done in a way that is going to have appeal in elections, because that is our system. The media, as we know, does not hold the interests of the people front and center. That they mirror what they think is going to sell and what is going to protect the big money that keeps them afloat. And corporations, they themselves are corporations. So it is counterproductive and a waste of time to expect the media to find a conscience. And the same is true of people. This goes back to meeting people where we are. And we are not in a place that, as a country, is willing to listen to big ideas when somebody has been murdered. It's just the way it is. But it's also what people respond to. We have to start there. Until you organize and do so successfully and in numbers big enough to make a difference at the ballot box, no resolution is coming. The murder of the United Healthcare CEO is not going to spark a revolution. Who knows? Maybe it will. I don't fucking know. A revolution is an overhaul of the system. It takes foundation and building blocks that online leftists do not have the patience to create, and it starts from within the existing system. And if you care about the healthcare system in America, did you vote in 2010 and in 2014 where Democrats got blown out in midterms when we had the opportunity to build upon the Affordable Care Act and get us to a place where 15 years later, had we had majorities throughout the 2010s and into the 2020s, we may be dealing with a very different system? Where were you in 2016 when Hillary Clinton ran on expanding and fixing the broken parts of the ACA? 2018 was a good year for us, but we didn't take the Senate back, and we didn't confirm. That kept us from blocking Trump's nomination of Amy Coney Barrett in 2020 and tipped the Supreme Court even more to the right. Where were you in 2020 when we had several Senate seats up and an opportunity to expand our Senate majority that ended up at 50-50 with the Georgia runoffs? 2022, where, had we elected Mandela Barnes in Wisconsin and Sherry Beasley in North Carolina, we would have a 49-51 Senate right now instead of a 47-53. Where were you in 2024? So if you care about these causes, you have to vote. You have to show up, and you have to vote for candidates who want to strengthen the Affordable Care Act, and then we can use that as our foundation for the next step, because that's how it happens. One more example, because I've been talking for a very long time, but the other example that I am thinking of is AOC and the Oversight Committee. We already pay, so I'm mixed on this, because we already pay the political price for being perceived as too far to the left. We already lose elections for that reason. So, I mean, the talking heads happily parrot the belief that we are too far to the left. They have squad members on TV as surrogates of the party to talk about current events and their take on it. We get very little political reward for resisting tiny movements to the left. So why resist? Why not let those who feel the old guard needs to be replaced and have a win by electing AOC as the chair of this committee? Because we aren't going to receive a pat on the back for refusing and electing a more moderate member. And she does speak to a lot of people that the center of gravity of the party doesn't. And yet, the flip side is that AOC's loss sparked backlash online from leftists, the same leftists who hold Kamala Harris personally responsible for her own loss, that are blaming the Dems, trademark symbol, for AOC's loss, rather than AOC herself for not earning the confidence of her colleagues and building a winning coalition among people that she needed to win over to earn that seat. So my biggest takeaway, and I've already said that a couple times, but I'm going to close with, stop rage baiting for engagement and stop both sidesing. Find a way. If you are a leftist and you are not pleased with how central the party is in your view, it is the beginning of 2025. We have just sworn in dictator-in-chief Donald Trump. Again, now is the time to start organizing for 2028. Now is the time to find a candidate that you want to run in the primary. And now's the time to start rebranding your ideas in a way that make them popular, not just to the Democratic Party, but to the country as a whole. And if you think the party is too far to the left and you are more of a centrist, now is the time to galvanize around a candidate, figure out who you want, start talking them up and organizing behind them. Because when we get into election cycles and it comes time for the primary and you're looking at your choices and you're going, oh, I don't like any of them. I don't like any of them. I wish we had better choices. Why can't we have this person? The question that people like me are going to ask is, what did you do to make it happen? Because they don't just appear out of thin air. So stop condemning the establishment, get to work, and figure out how your ideas, both left and center, are going to be palatable for a majority of the American population. I will talk to you next week. Have a good one.